ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with the 11th and just probably the most important UN resolution on the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, one that could actually lead to fighting. Just hours after Saddam Hussein's troops crossed into Kuwait, the Security Council demanded they pull out. They did not. 3 weeks later, the UN authorized an economic embargo. It has yet to be effective. Now, 16 weeks after the invasion, and after furious lobbying by the Bush administration, the Security Council appears ready to authorize the use of military force to back up its demand. ABC's John McWethy begins our broadcast on the campaign which the Bush administration is waging.
When asked if he had the votes to pass a UN resolution authorizing use of force, the president seemed confident. Behind closed doors this afternoon in New York, the U.S. formally circulated a draft of what it wants the Security Council to pass. The U.S. proposal would set a January 1st deadline for Iraq to pull out of Kuwait. After that deadline passes, the resolution would automatically authorize countries to, quote, use all necessary means to force Iraqi troops to leave. The January 1st deadline, U.S. officials concede, is just an opening position and could well slip to January 15th or February 1st by the time the resolution is voted on later this week.
January the 1st, if that's the deadline agreed, wouldn't be a date on which military action started. It would be the date after which member states would have authority to use force, if need be.
In Moscow today, Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz got more bad news. A first public warning from President Gorbachev that the Soviet Union will vote for the toughest UN measure yet if Iraqi troops don't get out of Kuwait immediately. Though U.S. officials believe they have the votes to pass this resolution in the UN, in order to make a stronger statement to Saddam Hussein, Secretary of State Baker wants the vote on this one to be overwhelming. Peter?
Well, John, even if it is overwhelming, how many of those nations will participate in the use of other means, or will it still be the U.S. alone?
Well, it will very much be the U.S. that has the most troops, Peter, but U.S. officials believe that the British, perhaps the French, will participate in the original fighting or initial fighting if it is necessary. And in fact, if the fighting does not go into Kuwait, that both the Egyptians and the Syrians will participate as well.
And this all has something of the ring of a deadline to it. Is that misleading? I think it is, isn't it?
Well, it is somewhat misleading. It is a deadline, of course, because there will be a mark in the sand here, but it does not mean that war will begin the day after this thing is actually passed.
Okay, John McWethy at the UN in New York tonight. Thanks very much. In Iraq today, Saddam Hussein seemed to be trying to make the point that the sanctions are already hurting. He said that hospital patients are dying for lack of food and medicine. You couldn't see any evidence of that. You could today see 3 very happy Americans, hostages told they were free after their relatives had traveled to Iraq. ABC's Dennis Trout is in Baghdad.
Seattle businessman Fred Harrington began filling out forms for an exit visa right after he called his wife.
Honey, you're not going to believe this, but I'm coming home.
We made it. John Stevenson is headed home, too, as is Clyde Jesse. Saddam Hussein met with the hostages and their relatives to answer their request for freedom, but he also used the moment to claim there is a grim development in Iraq because of economic sanctions imposed by the West.
If we were to go to our hospitals and ask them to provide us with the lists, then we would have discovered that the numbers are tragically high.
The Iraqi leader offered no proof of his charge, and diplomats doubt that it's true. Analysts here say he's trying to divide the West, both by sowing a sense of guilt and by releasing hostages to relatives who visit Baghdad. Iraq seems to want more Americans traveling here to lessen the chance of a military invasion by the West. The State Department has warned the relatives of hostages to stay away from Iraq because they too might be taken captive. Those who have come say governments have accomplished nothing, and now it's up to individuals.
Come as quick as you can. Don't leave your man over here. He belongs home. Give him a kiss.
That's a message that Washington will not like, but one that other families will find difficult to resist. Dennis Trout, ABC News, Baghdad.
In the 3 months since President Bush first sent troops to Saudi Arabia, we've heard actual combat with the Iraqi army described in a variety of ways. Given the way the Iraqis are now reported to have established their defensive fortifications in Kuwait, we were impressed to hear it described as an engineer's war. ABC's Jim Hickey has a report from Saudi Arabia on what that might mean.
The British call it a giant Viper. 600 feet of tubing filled with explosives trails behind a small rocket fired over a minefield. After it lands, the tubing is detonated. The shock wave sets off the mines in a chain reaction, clearing the way for Allied tanks and troops to advance. At least, that's the way it is supposed to work.
In this sort of engineering, you must count on things going wrong.
Iraq is reportedly building elaborate layers of fortified defenses, minefields, deep trenches, barbed wire, and walls of sand called berms. The British Royal Engineers, under the command of U.S. Marines, would lead the way, trying to knock down the berms with armored bulldozers. To cross anti-tank ditches, they would use reinforced plastic tubes strong enough to hold 68-ton tanks. Iraq may try to slow them down with fire, filling trenches with flaming oil, also causing smoke and confusion.
It would in fact be very difficult to see anything, and there'd be absolute chaos.
Another reminder that on the ground there is no such thing as a surgical assault. Jim Hickey, ABC News, Saudi Arabia.
In a moment, the day's other news. A Japanese industrial giant buys a Hollywood dream.